Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains rebuilt from the ground up. Not really, it's the same thing I do every time. And today, we are going to discuss locomotive rebuilds. Yes, rebuilds of locomotives that didn't go very well. See, this was actually a hard one for me to research because there aren't that many rebuilds that went poorly. Usually, when you rebuild a locomotive, or really any kind of vehicle, the reason you're doing it is because you've already isolated the problems with the original version. A rebuild is generally used to either save costs when it comes to buying a new locomotive, you just modernize an old one, or fixing issues that were existent with the original version. But on occasion, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the rebuild actually takes a perfectly good locomotive and completely ruins it. These are 5 trains that were completely ruined. The Montana Rail Link SD19-1. This is an odd one, because to say that it ruined a perfectly good diesel, I mean, that's true, but this is kind of a Frankenstein level rebuild we got going on here. They were actually rebuilt from several EMD diesels, mostly SD35s and SD9s, and they only ever made 2 of them, 651 and 652. Montana Rail Link is a Class 2 railroad in the United States. In the early 90s, they were having some financial issues. Pretty bad ones, actually. And they had to update their fleet, but really didn't have the money for new locomotives. So they thought, cost-saving measure, why don't we just rebuild some of the old ones with parts we already have lying around? We can take good components from one diesel, put it in one that needs those components, and swap them around and stuff. It'll be great. And it wasn't actually that great. It didn't go horribly, but these locomotives were hindered due to the nature of the rebuilds. First of all, they were already having financial issues from the get-go, but they also didn't have as many spare parts just lying around as they really thought they did, so they didn't have that many resources to actually do more than 2 of these rebuilds. 651 got the worst of it. It was originally built with components that were taken from a scrapped Union Pacific locomotive in SD24. They quickly learned there was a reason that locomotive was scrapped. Those components were old, and they started breaking after a rather short time. They had to be replaced with more miscellaneous components. Number 652 had a better go at it, taking some components from a GP38-2 and an SD38-2, but it still wasn't considered very successful just due to the lack of spare parts involved and the financial issues. Plus, MRL started receiving offers, very lucrative ones, from leasing companies for newer diesels. It was more financially reasonable to lease newer diesels rather than fiddle around with these awkward rebuilds that used so many different parts from so many different locomotives that it was kind of difficult to manage them. Like, you basically built them into a non-standard thing by doing what they did, and didn't really improve performance in any way. They weren't necessarily worse in that regard, but they weren't any better, so what was the point of it? That's why there were only 2 of the SD19-1s ever created. According to my research, both locomotives are still around as of 2015, but they were sold to Columbia Basin Railroad in Washington. The Progress Rail PR43Cs. These were a group of 3 locomotives that were originally EMD SD50s. They were jointly designed by both Progress Rail and Norfolk Southern, and development started in 2008. Now the SD50s, they were all built between 1980 and 1987, so by 2008, the idea of replacing or rebuilding them wasn't unreasonable. The main difference between the original SD50s and the PR43Cs is the changeout for the prime mover. The SD50s used an EMD 645, but the PR43Cs were given Caterpillar engines, manufactured by that company, the Caterpillar company. Specifically 2 of them, a 3,600 horsepower C175 engine as well as a 700 horsepower C18 engine. This buffed the overall horsepower of the diesels by nearly 1,000. The SD50s topped out about 3,600. With the new Caterpillar engines, the PR43Cs hit 4,300. A substantial improvement, but it didn't actually work that well. When they were working, yeah, they had a great amount of horsepower, improving their capabilities, but they weren't reliable anymore. The original prime mover in the SD50s may have been old, but it was proven, and it was very reliable, generally speaking, even with its age. The Caterpillar engines did not mesh with railroad operation at all. Even with a larger radiator section to help them out, it didn't really do much of anything. They failed repeatedly. Malfunctions were common on them, much more than the old but again proven SD50s. They were so bad that it didn't even last 10 years after the changes. They were retired from Norfolk Southern in 2017, and all 3 of them were scrapped in 2018. The British Rail Standard Class 9F Franco-Crosty rebuilds. Of course you would ruin a rebuild. Of course you would ruin a perfectly good locomotive. Of course you would do that. Of course you would do that. I don't know what I expected. When I first came up to this list, I'm like, BR is going to be on this list. There's no way I'm going to avoid it. And of course, here we are again. Why me? All I wanted to do was talk about trains and history. I just wanted to have a nice, fun YouTube channel, a nice, fun YouTube career to support me and my son. But at what cost, British Rail? At what cost? Explain yourself. So we've talked about the 9S before, and in fact I believe they appeared on one of my best ever trains list. And there's a reason for that. 9S were incredible pieces of steam locomotive technology. Honestly, they probably encompass the ultimate tier of British-built steam locomotives. They are great, and one of my favorites. So naturally, British Rail felt the need to ruin them by doing a weird experiment. I mentioned Franco-Crosty boilers, and people actually mentioned that I should talk about these when I talked about Belgium's Big Chunkus Quadruplex locomotive, because they kind of worked well in that way. The way the Franco-Crosty boilers worked is complicated, but I'll try to explain it as simply as I possibly can. The main difference between it and a regular, conventional steam engine is that they use both exhaust steam and exhaust gases from the firebox. Normally, you just use the steam, but not with the Franco-Crosty setup. They have a single cylindrical water drum that runs along the underside of the main boiler barrel. Locomotives that use it do have a standard chimney at the front like they normally would, but this is only used during startup. In normal operation, all the gases went through the fire tubes, not just the steam. This led to a second smoke box that was situated beneath the boiler, where the gases would actually emerge on the right-hand side of the locomotive. It sounds really weird because it really is. The main benefit of doing this is that it actually preheats the water in the feed water heater, so it enters the boiler at a higher temperature. In theory, it should increase overall efficiency, and sometimes it does. This isn't one of them. The 9Fs did not actually take well to the Franco-Crosties. They hated them, actually. Everyone hated them. The crews actually nicknamed them, allegedly, Frankly Crusty, which... Okay, that's pretty funny. But when you take the outstanding 9Fs and make them terrible, I see why they would be pretty mad. Efficiency wasn't increased enough to warrant how complicated the Franco-Crosty system was. Their complex nature increased maintenance costs overall. Oh, and also the crews were miserable. Because of the exhaust coming out the side of the locomotive and not out of the standard funnel, it meant that in a crosswind, the driver and firemen got a whole heap of noxious fumes in their face. Wonderful. All while the locomotives were more expensive and not really that much more efficient. At all. In fact, financially, they were less efficient. It was great. Some say they were actually converted back to regular 9Fs, and that's not exactly what they did. What they did was they modified them to seal off the preheater drum. This caused them to operate conventionally, except that then they suffered a reduced ability to generate steam. It actually meant that their power classification was reduced from 9F back to 8F. Go figure. They were still useful enough to last on British railways, until the end of steam. They were all withdrawn by 1967, and not a single one of the modifications was preserved. Although, like I've mentioned before, a few of the 9Fs did survive into preservation, so at least we got the good ones. The London and Northeastern Railway Class A2/2. Oh boy. Yeah, we're talking about Edward Thompson again. And can we talk about how polarizing this guy is? I got so many extremes on my video about him. Basically saying, no, he was actually great and got a bad rap. Or, no, he was absolutely worst and you should have been harsher on him. And I'm like, I just gave you the information that I could get from verified actual sources on this dude. And no, podcasts from other content creators don't count as verified sources. I just want to say that. Maybe what they said was true, and maybe he did get a bad rap. I did defend him when I pointed out that he was the chief mechanical engineer of the railways during World War II. It was a hard job, and while I did mention that he had depression because of the death of his wife, what I didn't mention is that he also lost his house during the Blitz and had to effectively live in his office at the railway. So what I'm trying to say is that whether or not he was good at his job, he was having a hard time. Be that as it may, a lot of his rebuilds are questionable. Some are not as bad as they're made out to be, but in the A2/2's case, no, that didn't turn out that well. And I'd probably get a bunch of comments about them if I didn't put them on the list. Thompson really wanted to design useful Pacific-type locomotives, 462s, and in this case they were rebuilds of the P2 class, which were originally 282 express passenger locomotives. The Class P2s had originally been designed by Sir Nigel Gresley and were considered pretty good for what they were. And to be fair, he wasn't unreasonable with the notion of rebuilding them. It sounds bad on paper if you don't understand the context. The reason he rebuilt them specifically wasn't necessarily that they were bad, because they weren't, but they were in service between Edinburgh and Aberdeen, and that route is very windy. 282 is a longer fixed wheelbase, and they were causing maintenance problems for both the track and the locomotives. Specifically, their crank axles kept failing. Thompson didn't just redo the wheels, either. Their boiler barrels were shortened by a little over 2 feet, and they were given a new front end that was designed with 20-inch by 26-inch, or 508mm by 660mm cylinders. He could have had all 3 cylinders drive a single axle, but Thompson decided to use divided drive, which had the middle cylinder driving the first pair of driving wheels, and the outside cylinders the middle pair. That sounds really weird, because it is, but he wanted to keep the original 3 connecting rods the same length, so in order to compensate for this weird fixation, the outside cylinders were set back behind the bogie, which is also really weird. He also removed Gresley's conjugated valve gear, and gave them independent sets of Walschaert's valve gear, which is something Thompson did a lot. Though many have pointed out Walschaert's valve gear is really good, and it was better on maintenance than Gresley's. In wartime, it did make some logical sense to use Walschaert's instead. Now the rebuilds weren't all bad. They were lighter, for one, and this meant they had a higher power-to-weight ratio. And they were really good for hauling high-speed expresses, but they didn't ride very well, feeling very unsafe at higher speeds. Their lightweight and less driving wheels also meant that they didn't have very good adhesion, and wheel slip was pretty bad on them. Their frames also tended to jostle around, vibrating and loosening the fittings, because by using equal length connecting rods, as well as the divided drive, meant that the center cylinder was way further forward than the outside cylinders. They didn't work very well. They weren't any better. They were actually a lot worse in pretty much every conceivable way, which is really frustrating because there were only 6 P2s originally. And then there were 6 A2/2s. Yes, he rebuilt all of them. Every single one was rebuilt. And no, not a single one of them was preserved. Because why would they be? They were ruined, absolutely destroyed, because of a weird experiment Thompson decided to do. The Milwaukee Road Class EP2s. Now, I've actually discussed these before. They actually appeared on my top 5 worst ever locomotives. Not because of their original form, but because of these rebuilds that we're going to talk about today. But it's such a case of a catastrophic destruction of a phenomenally good locomotive that I couldn't ignore it. I mean, Edward Thompson's rebuilds were questionable, but technically most of them did kind of work. Some of them were worse than they originally were, but they weren't so bad as to be useless. But the rebuilds of the EP2s dumpstered them. They went from being one of the best electric locomotives in America, right up there with the GG1s, to being absolutely garbage tier. The EP2s were 5 electric locomotives that were built by General Electric in 1919. They were sometimes called bipolars because of their bipolar electric motors. And for their time, they were ludicrously powerful. They had a max speed of 70 miles per hour and were rated at a continuous 3,100 horsepower in 1919. And they were good, genuinely. They were reliable. They'd seen extensive use over the years, especially during World War II, so their components were wearing out. They needed to be changed up. The rebuilds were actually going to include additional traction motor shunts for increased speed, roller bearings, multiple unit capability, which they hadn't had originally because they just didn't need it, they were powerful enough on their own, flash boilers, as well as streamlining to make them a bit more stylish. Now all 5 of them were renumbered in 1939, from E1 to E5. E5 was the first one to be rebuilt, and she was rebuilt at the Tacoma shops, as kind of a prototype rebuild to make sure it would actually work better than the original EP2s. It did actually perform as advertised. The rebuild was successful, but it went over budget, so the other 4 were instead given to the Milwaukee shops. And that is where the crippling mistake was made. See, the Milwaukee shop employees weren't actually accustomed to working on electric locomotives. To be frank, they simply didn't know what they were doing. But that didn't matter. They were going to do it, whether they liked it or not. In the opinion of Electrification Department head Lawrence Wiley, they did a poor job. His successor, T.B. Kirk, later stated that he once saw a group of disconnected wires in a newly rebuilt EP2 that were just bundled together, and they were tagged with a handwritten message saying, "We don't know where these go." That is the level of sheer incompetence that went into rebuilding the other 4 EP2s. And boy howdy, did they just not work at all. Honestly, the fact that they were able to power up at all was a miracle, but when they did, they were prone to electrical fires and frequent failures. And they were so completely screwed up that the Tacoma shops, who, again, did actually know what they were doing, struggled to correct the problems. They were so badly ruined after the rebuilds, which were carried out in 1953, that it actually killed off the entire class when it came to using them. Their problems never really went away, and they were slowly phased out in favor of more modern diesel locomotives. The railroad retired them by 1960. All of them were scrapped in 1962 with the exception of E2. E2, one of the bad rebuilds by the way, was actually donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri. She's been there ever since, and actually well taken care of aesthetically speaking, especially considering she seems to be outdoors according to all the pictures. So despite being completely, absolutely 100% crippled, destroyed, eradicated because of a terrible rebuild job, at least one of them did still survive into preservation, and people can still fondly look on them and remember that, at least originally, these were awesome locomotives. They just ruined them. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundew 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeplate 17, Anzac A1, and Dozzy Was It. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.